Welcome to Virtual Geography 178 lecture on forests, forestry, and wildfires. In previous lectures, we focused on agriculture and water issues surrounding agriculture. In this unit, we're going to focus on forestry practices. Forestry is in many ways a form of agriculture, yet it is much different in terms of the controversy surrounding the different forestry practices we implement, and of course the issue of wildfire surrounding those harvesting methods and the new advent of the urban wildlife interface that makes wildfires a more and more controversial issue. For this unit, what you want to focus on are two readings. The Cronin reading, The Trouble with Wilderness, is a very good reading. It's one of these readings that within the world of environmentalism and just the whole way that we view wilderness, this was a very controversial reading, and you'll see why it's very controversial. Cronin is a environmental historian at UW-Madison. After Cronin wrote this, he received quite a few letters from people in the environmental movement telling him that they were quite displeased by him. I think you'll like it. I like it because of the controversy and the discussions that it opens up. Another one is by Nancy Langston, who wrote Forest Dreams, Forest Nightmares. This is another good one. This shows you that the issue of forestry isn't about the evil logger and the heroic environmentalist. What it comes down to is you have people who look at forestry in terms of a logging perspective that is viewed upon as very sustainable as a forestry practice. And what this chapter is going to point out, it's an introductory chapter, but what it points out is that forestry in one forest is very different than the way forestry is practiced in another forest. If we take a look at forests, you can see that forests cover the world in different belts. The belt that most people are familiar with is right in here. This is your tropical rainforests or your equatorial rainforests. These are a very small portion of the globe if you start looking at other forests in the world. Yet the forests in the tropics are very important because they truly do sequester carbon better than any other forest out there. If you start looking at forests up by us, these mixed forests of conifers and deciduous trees, or trees with needles and trees with leaves, broad leaves, these forests are good for sequestering carbon in the younger stages of their life, but in these mature forests, they don't really do a very good job. And of course, up in here, this blue swath of forest, this is your boreal forests or your taiga. This is the largest expanse of forests in the world. The problem with the boreal forests is that what we're finding is that they regrow very slow. They have a very slow regrowth rate, and depending on where you are in those forests depends on the type of timber. But if you're up in these northern reaches, you can be looking at trees that have about a 3-inch diameter and they're hundreds of years old. Very, very different forests. They're some of the forests that are being logged at the most rapid rates right now. People tend to think of the only logging that goes on is in these areas. Yet, if you go over here, in this area of the world, down over by the Kamchatka Peninsula and this east coast of Russia, this area is experiencing some very heavy logging. And with the logging, we're seeing lots of issues with habitat as well. If we look at forests, we can break them down like this. You can see that tropical moist forests are at 43%, boreal forests are at 33%. If you start looking at all these forests together, about 9.6 billion acres of the planet are covered by forest. If we look at forests, we look at them for a variety of uses. Some people might look at them for recreational use. Some people might look at them for a place to take refuge from getting away from it all. Other people look at forests for timber products, whether or not it's lumber or paper. This brings up issues of sustainable forestry. At what rate can you cut down a forest so it'll regenerate in a reasonable manner, so you don't run out of trees to cut down? We look at this we see these two graphs over here. One of the graphs represents non-sustainable forestry practices. The other one represents sustainable forestry practices. Well, how do you figure that out? What you do is you look at a forest and you say the area of forest land available divided by the number of years to maturity. If we take a look at this forest with that, if we have a cut rate of 20 acres a year, we're going to end up with the same portion of forest that's mature and non-mature after 100 years. Over here we have cut rate of 400 acres a year. After 50 years, they're not going to have any more mature forest. This this little equation is very simple, but this simple equation has brought about quite a bit of controversy because it gets into how do you cut down the forest? Do you engage in clear cutting methods? Do you do selective cutting methods? Are you going to be able to get the amount of money out of this forest that makes your business practice even feasible? Or are you in something to where the amount of taxes and the amount of management that you put into this forest is not even worth it? It really depends on the timber type. If you're dealing with timber that's not very good quality, if it doesn't yield a high price, you might be better off just engaging in clear cutting methods. The problem is that oftentimes with clear cutting, you're not dealing with sustainable forestry methods. You see this quite a bit in the northern Great Lakes states in places like Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, to where many timber companies now are selling off their property to people who are interested in that land for hunting land because these timber companies have figured out that the amount of time needed for these forests to regenerate goes well beyond what they would have to pay for that in taxes until that comes about. So they're starting to sell off that land. We look at harvest techniques. There's a lot of different harvest techniques out there. Shelter wood is one that most people would link to very high-end woods. And with shelter wood, what you have is you would have a very expensive type of tree that in many ways is just like a big agricultural field that you're just going and plucking out the ones that are ripe, if you would. High-end woods would be things like black walnut, hickory, um, in some cases maple if it's a hardwood maple. These trees can fetch up to about $20,000 per trunk. In this regard, having a shelter wood plot is a very good investment. I tell the students in my lecture class, if you're looking to invest your money, buy a parcel of land and plant it in some type of high value wood, and your grandchildren will have the biggest inheritance ever. That is very, very safe from any type of market fluctuation because the price of high end timber can only go up. But you'll notice that with shelter wood, it's a homogeneous plot. It's all of the same tree. So you would have a plantation filled with black walnut. Or you could even have it with red pine. Red pine is actually a good one, at least in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, because you get a good tax break with it, and there's a demand for red pine now for log cabin homes. It would have to be grown well, though. They're small plots. These are not very big. Now, small, I'm saying relative to the thousands or hundreds of acre size plots in clear cutting. Selective cutting is another one very similar to shelter wood, but with selective cutting, you're dealing with a mixed age and value of trees. You would often see this, perhaps some of you have engaged in this, or your relatives have engaged in this when they might have inherited a piece of property from someone who bequeathed it to them in their will. Other times children will have their parents pass away and they'll have a parcel of land. They need to deal with the taxes on it, so they might engage in some type of a selective cutting. In that case, what you do is you would have somebody who's involved with timber harvesting go out there with sometimes some light equipment, sometimes some heavier equipment to put in some smaller roads, but you would just go out and you would take out the trees that you want cut out. Where I come from in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, you sometimes see where people want to just get rid of all of the popple because the popple, the paper companies will buy it up. So the machines will go in and they'll just take out all the popple, but they leave all else. Sometimes people will say, well, we would like to get all of our maple trees taken out, or all trees of this diameter would get taken out. Those would get harvested, but the other smaller trees would be left behind. It just depends on what you would like to do, but that's selective cutting. It's not the same as shelter wood because shelter wood is all of the same type of tree. Finally, clear cutting is the most controversial of these. Clear cutting is the most widely used, and as I stated, the most controversial because what you do in the case of clear cutting is you go in and you cut down every single tree within the parcel that you want to cut down. It's very controversial because it does lead to soil erosion. It doesn't only lead to soil erosion, it can lead to lots of wildlife habitat losses. If we start looking at how species are going extinct in places or endangered in places like the east coast of Russia or in the tropical rainforest, it's because of the clear cutting operations. There's literally, you go from a forested stand to nothing there. However, from the side of timber management, if you're a logging company and you have to put in all these roads and you have to put in all this infrastructure to get to sometimes these very remote areas, you need to be able to pay for that operation. And in order to pay for that operation, you need to get the maximum value at the time of harvest. It's just wouldn't be worth it to spend sometimes millions, tens of millions of dollars to put in these roads and get everything ready to get this lumber out and then only haul out a few of the bigger trees unless they're quite large and they have a quite high value to them. More often than that, though, you're dealing with trees that are going towards just your general run-of-the-mill lumber and paper. So there's not a very big profit margin. Forestry is it's a very interesting profession because when you have these foresters assessing these stands, when they make a bid, when these companies make a bid, if they underbid, they can lose out, but if they overbid, they can lose out as well by not getting that contract. It's a very interesting world in the world of forestry and harvesting. And then finally, there's a new one that's coming out called biomass. Biomass, in many ways, is like clear cutting, but with biomass, what you have is you have very small plots of land that people will just harvest, and they take everything in that plot of land and they chip it up, and that biomass is used for fuel and electricity generation. This is not without controversy. There's a few places that are getting put up in Wisconsin that have been facing some controversy surrounding this because oftentimes the projected need for wood is not correct, and the companies start needing to bring in fuel from other areas than just the surrounding locale. Here's an example of clear cutting. This is from Vietnam. This is from a trip I was doing some research in Vietnam, in the Central Highlands of Vietnam, back in 2010. And what you can see here is you can see these barren hill slopes. These barren hill slopes are barren because they're cut devoid of trees, and then they're burned to maintain them from having any trees. What you get is during heavy rains, you get slope failures on these in these areas. And indeed, if you start looking across the landscape, you see all these scars on the land from where you had slope failure. You have to remember that in these soils, it's these trees that are binding the soil together, and when it rains, you can get typhoons moving through this area. It comes down very hard, and it can lead to lots of slope instability. Some of the bigger disasters in the world, if you start looking at the bigger disasters associated with slope failure, many times these slope failures were associated with some heavy logging practices on the slopes that failed. Here we have an example of a clear cutting operation. This was close to my family's property in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. This was trying to remain calm and unbiased on here. This was an individual whose father perished, and they received the property in the will, and they were from the lower part of Michigan and didn't really have a vested interest in this landscape. And to the chagrin of many of the locals around, had uh, the entire parcel leveled. And what you're looking at here is an image that I took to document, to make sure that nothing was going on to our property. You see this little blue mark right there that represents the property line, where this operation cut down every single tree on, I think in the total of their acreage was well over 160 acres. Example of clear cutting, this machine that he's operating can grab onto those trees and cut them down and saw them into 100-inch lengths in a matter of minutes. This is a video. If you were to go onto the lecture that's posted, you could watch this video to watch this machine in operation. Here we have an example of select cutting method. This is what the stand of timber looked like before the select cutting method occurred. You can see a mixed variety of trees. You have some balsams, you have lots of tall, skinny sugar maples. Back in there you have sugar maples of various sizes. What in this case the property owner decided to do was just to selectively cut some of the larger diameter maples and some poplar that were in there as well. And what you have afterwards is this. Now this is a different season, but looking into this forest you can see it's a much thinner forest with many of the trees thinned out. This is a very sustainable method, but it doesn't always work out well, because if you're in very remote, rugged areas, it's going to be very difficult to haul these trees out, and it's much more economically feasible to do the clear cutting operation. But remember, you have to go back to that primary rule of what is sustainable forestry and what is not. Silviculture is in many ways what we're looking at with your monoculture plots, where you have your monoculture plot of high value timbers, and you go through and you just cut out the trees here and there to maintain your business. Massive long-term benefits. I can't stress this enough. If anybody has a piece of property and you're looking to improve the value of that property, you should really seriously look into your local natural resource conservation service. Often has sales every spring. I'm not really sure about the Wisconsin tax benefits, but I know in Michigan, I'm not sure about Minnesota either, but I know in Michigan you get a very big tax break for putting your land in this. You get a carbon tax offset. Very, very good way to go. You can even put your land into an easement so you don't have to pay the amount of taxes that you have. And it may not be something that you would see in your lifetime, but definitely within your children's lifetime, you could leave behind a nice inheritance for your kids. Now, something like red pine, let's say some of you in the class have some capital to work with. If you would consider, you had some sandy soils, if you considered planting white pine or red pine and managing that to where you're thinning them out and you have nice long straight trunks at the bottom, you can stand to when you reach retirement age, you would be sitting on a fairly decent amount of money. That was the only risk that you would have with that, I suppose, is if you had some type of a disturbance come along. Southern pine plantations are probably some of the best examples of tree farming. In places like Kentucky, in the temperate deciduous forest, you have these tree plantations with silviculture that have things like the black walnut and the hickory that fetch a very high value for those trees. In the deep south, where a lot of your cardboard is coming from, and a lot of it depends on where you're getting the lumber from, but if you have loblolly pine, it's a very rapid growth rate, 20 to 35 years. The rainfall and the soils down there for now are able to produce trees at a very rapid rate, to where you can have a private parcel of land with the sustainable forestry practices that is quite viable and productive. One of the issues though in the south is what we're seeing is that because these soils are so old, they have a limited amount of nutrients in them. And if by growing trees, you're taking them out of the system. That means all the calcium, potassium, and phosphorus, instead of when that tree weathers and all those minerals go back in, that's being taken out. So already some of these plantations are seeing a tapering off and slowing of their growth rate. That means that just like with agriculture, just like with agriculture, you have an issue where you have to start putting in external inputs of fertilizer. And with these silviculture plantations, sometimes you're dealing with thousands of acres, and application of that isn't going to be by going on a tractor. What you're going to have to do is start using aerial delivery platforms to spread out that fertilizer. Plus, you're talking about a massive cost in external fertilizer. Agroforestry is another form of silviculture. Agroforestry is where you have incorporation of trees and woody species into other forms of agriculture. You can also have silvipastoral agriculture or even silvagroforestry. In silvipastoral agroforestry, what you have is you have your stand of trees, much as down in here, and within your stand of trees, you have some type of a grazing operation. You might have cattle, you might have goats, you might have chickens, whatnot, but you're kind of interlayering your agricultural practices. You start looking in certain areas of the world where land is not as abundant in the United States, and this is very much a common practice. What we're seeing now is we're starting to see silvopastoral agroforestry, and this gets interesting because some individuals are taking advantage of the shade provided by trees and the fact that these agricultural systems can help water the trees and provide nutrients, and they're putting in fish farms within these different forest stands. Some things to consider if you're looking at getting a high amount of production out of your land in a sustainable manner. I just want to quickly go over this graph of wood fiber usage. This graph is fairly interesting because what we can see is that right here, this line, this dashed line, paper and paperboard, this one's interesting because during the revolution of the internet in the mid-90s, there was all these projections that paper use was going to go way down and paper was going to be a thing of the past. Quite the contrary, with the advent of the internet, we just saw the amount of paper production increase dramatically. One of the biggest facets was this might change with so many different mobile devices was people printing off emails left and right. So did paper demand go down with the advent of the internet as people projected? No, it actually went up significantly. We take a look at forest lands by continent. Now, I really don't like by continent, but for the sake of this lecture, we just want to generalize. We start looking at this, we can see that between 1990 and the year 2000, we're going now into the year 2013 coming up. You look at that and we see that places like Asia and Africa, North and Central America, where do we suppose this is going on? This is more Central America and regions of Mexico, are all diminishing trees. South America, diminishing trees. Oceania, diminishing trees. There's a story behind each of these. You look over here at Europe, Europe is actually gaining in trees. That's because lots of land in production for timber in Europe, lots of land that's in agricultural production in Europe that formerly is now being reverted back into forest land. The other issue is that I've seen this many times before where people praise Japan for their increase in forest area, Europe, and the United States. What you have to remember is we're in a global economy, and what these countries are doing is they're just outsourcing where they're getting their timber from. You look over here at Oceania, a lot of that timber loss in Oceania is places like Indonesia and the Philippines where there's some very heavy deforestation going on. South America, of course, this is related to the Amazon rain basin. We take a look at North and Central America. This diminishing amount of trees isn't so much going to be in the United States. The United States has more land and forest now than they did at the turn of the century. But if we start looking at places like Mexico, where monarch butterflies winter over, those areas are being deforested at a heavy rate. You also look at Canada. Canada is experiencing some fairly rapid deforestation as well up in the boreal forest regions. Africa, this is going to be your equatorial regions of Africa. Asia, uh, this number has likely gotten very much bigger with the rise of heavy logging practices in the boreal forests of Russia. We look at forest land in the United States, and we can see that northern Wisconsin and Minnesota are fairly unique in terms of the fact that the northern Great Lakes have some extensive amounts of forest in them. We can also see an extensive amount of forest over here in northern New England, and we see lots of forests and forests going on down here in the southeast. This is a mix of both hardwood forests, some very high value hardwood forests in areas like Kentucky and West Virginia, Tennessee, to some very low value pine plantations down here in the southern Piedmont. Over in the west United States, you see these swaths of forest land. These are mostly mountain forests. And really, if we get into the western United States, the heavy logging practices don't really occur in any large degree until you get over here in the Pacific Northwest. Now, the Pacific Northwest, very high reproduction rate for these stands of trees, and a very wet climate, some fairly fertile soils, make this a very big forestry region. And it varies between very sustainable practices and some not so sustainable forestry practice. It just depends on the company involved. Now you look over here at Alaska and you can see a wide expanse of forest. This is where you need to know what the forest types are and the climate. Because even though Alaska has forests going way far north, huge amounts of forest, a lot of this forest, except for down in here, where you have, in many ways, a temperate rainforest, these forests are that taiga or boreal forest with very slow reproductive rates, not a lot of biomass. Some of these trees almost look like little cactuses when you take a look at them. We take a look at forest by forest type, and we can see that you have your softwoods and you have your hardwoods. Now, what's the difference between softwoods and hardwoods? Well, hardwood is often a deciduous tree. Now, not all deciduous trees are hardwoods. There's things like popple, soft maple. So soft maples would be red maple. That they're not very hard. They're not very dense, and they don't have they're not considered a hardwood. They're just a deciduous tree. But many deciduous trees are hardwood. When you start looking at the value of lumber, hardwoods tend to have a much higher value than softwoods. Hardwoods are often used to make furniture and floors. They're highly coveted by woodworkers, myself being one. Uh, you use them in heating operations. You wouldn't want to use conifers. You can use some softwoods in heating, but a hardwood's going to have more BTUs. It's going to be denser. It's going to burn hotter. And most people from the northern Great Lakes understand that you just don't want to burn things like pine in your house, otherwise you're going to run the risk of a chimney fire. Now, softwoods, these are your conifers. There's some deciduous. Like I said, something like a red maple is going to be considered a softwood. Most softwoods go towards things like paper fiber or construction grade lumber. So if you're building a house and your 2x4s, all your 2x materials, which are actually only an inch and a half, this is all going to be softwoods. This is going to be either coming from up in the west coast of Canada or from the southern United States. Also, plywood, lots of plywood is going to come from the southeastern United States. It's a lot less money than hardwood for lumber. I put lumber because that's what people east would say. There's less BTUs in heating. So if we were to boil it down, if you were looking at purchasing lumber and you wanted to make high-end furniture, or you just wanted to make some nice stuff, you would get hardwood. If you were looking to burn fuel inside your house, you would be looking at hardwood. If you're looking at construction or paper and cardboard, you'd be looking at softwoods, which majority of timber harvested in our region of the world is softwood for paper fiber production. We look at forest ownership. Forest ownership is interesting because in the United States, when we start looking at federal versus private lands, we can see that the majority of land in the western United States is highly federal land. However, Washington State sticks out as an area that is significantly lower of well, where you have some, you don't have as much federal land and you have mixed in some private ownership. That's because in the state of Washington there's some very productive forests out there that make it worth it to own privately. We look over here, we see that if we start looking at this in terms of industry or very large industries owning parcels of land, we have Washington, Oregon, and California sticking out. We also have Michigan sticking out. We have Maine as quite high. In the state of Maine, there's very little national forest land, very little state land. The majority of land in Maine is actually owned privately. Once you get into the interior of Maine, you're dealing with a very large private tracts of land. We look over here in terms of private, we can see this is where the southeast really jumps in. This is where you have, this would be your little monoculture plots of trees that are being cut and uh, sold to various enterprises. It depends on where you are. If you're in Kentucky, Tennessee, you might have some very high value hardwood plots. If you're down in here, you might have your little private holdings of pine that are going to go towards cardboard and plywood, OSB fiber board, that type of thing. Let's move into logging in the Great Lakes and just have a brief discussion of logging in the Great Lakes. Logging in the Great Lakes uh, wasn't always what it is today, and the way that we view forest in the Great Lakes isn't always the way it was today. I'm just going to briefly go through this, but just I want to show you this. Some of this gets into what the Cronin piece talks about, but we didn't always view forest the same. We take a look at this. This is something that Christina Hupy produced. We can see that within the Great Lakes, I'm not going to get into too much detail on this, but if we look at the change of how we viewed forest, it changed with time. To where a long time ago, people looked at forest with fear and viewed them as inexhaustible supplies of wood. If you look over here between the 1920s and 1945, you can see that that changed over to a feeling of guilt that, wow, we cut down all these trees. The Eau Claire area, if you look at photos of the Eau Claire area from back at the turn of the century, there were no trees anywhere. It was a treeless landscape for the most part. If we look at some other factors here, we look at things like the landscape, we can see that we are logging old growth trees and we're logging only near rivers at the earliest part of logging. And if you go to more recent times, we're looking at primarily regeneration of lands. Lots of the lands regenerating now in places like Wisconsin, northern Minnesota, are areas that used to be in agriculture that were cleared during the logging era that people moved into. They're called stump farmers, moving into areas where they didn't have to cut down trees and they had to go. Oftentimes these soils were so sandy they had to be abandoned, and now they've gone back into tree growth. This is just an image showing how forests were viewed back in that era, but what you can see here is that a cabin was seen as a beacon of civilization, and you had the dark unknown of the wilderness beyond. These are just some images of the logging era in the northern Great Lakes. This is what you would have seen on the landscape. You can see that these logs are quite large. These are not small logs, and this is what would have been common form. This is what you would have seen in the spring of the year in places such as Menominee, Michigan, Marinette, Wisconsin, Peshtigo, Wisconsin, Eau Claire, Chippewa Falls. These are all areas where in the spring all these logs would be floated down the river and they would go into these holding areas where you had all these logs to be shipped off to different markets. And this is what you also would have seen in the landscape, was lumber mills all over the place. And these lumber mills everywhere, there was smoldering fires associated with these, and there was just pollution all over. This is what you would see looking across the landscape was this pallor of smoke from all the different fires smoldering. It was ripe for a massive catastrophic fire, and indeed that's what happened with the Peshtigo fire slash Chicago fire.